The fence was already standing when Susanna Harper rode back from town. She pulled her mare to a dead stop at the edge of her property and stared at the neat line of cedar posts driven deep into the red Oklahoma earth, fresh-cut rails running between them in a perfect rectangle around her garden plot. The wood was pale and raw, still bleeding sap at the joints, and the construction was precise. The kind of precise that only came from a man who had done something like this 1,000 times and knew exactly what he was doing and exactly why. She had not asked for a fence. She had not asked for anything from Jeremiah Haskins, not once in the 4 months since he had ridden onto the neighboring parcel of land and started building his own life out of sweat and will and silence. She had barely spoken 20 words to the man. She had nodded at him across the creek. She had watched from her kitchen window as he hauled timber and laid stone, and moved through his days with the kind of quiet intensity that made her stomach do something she had decided firmly she was not going to think about. And now he had built her a fence, without asking, without a word, without a note or an explanation or even the decency to be standing there in front of it when she arrived home so she could unleash the fury rising hot and fast behind her sternum. Susanna swung down from the mare with enough force that the horse sidestepped nervously. She tied the reins to the old hitching post by the porch and walked toward the fence with her fists at her sides, studying it with eyes that missed nothing. He had used good cedar. He had spaced the rails correctly. He had not once trampled her young tomato plants, or disturbed the rows of squash and beans she had so carefully tended. The gate, and there was a gate, a real gate with iron hinges she could not imagine how he had afforded, swung smoothly on its pins when she pushed it. It was the finest fence she had ever seen in her life, and she was furious about it. Not because it was bad, because it was so unbearably, presumptuously good. Because some part of her that she was desperately trying to silence recognized what it meant when a man built something beautiful for a woman without being asked, and that recognition scared her down to the marrow. She turned on her heel and walked straight across the boundary line between their properties. Jeremiah Haskins was splitting wood at the side of his cabin when she came around the corner, and he heard her boots on the dry ground and looked up before she said a single word. He was taller than she remembered from a distance. His hair was dark and thick beneath his hat, his jaw shadowed with 2 days of beard, and his eyes, she had never been close enough to see the color of his eyes before, not really, were a deep and serious gray, the color of storm clouds building over the plains. He set the axe head down in the dirt and waited. He did not look guilty or defensive. He looked like a man who had made a decision he stood behind completely and was prepared to account for it, and that steadiness infuriated her even more than the fence. "You built a fence around my garden," Susanna said. "Yes," he said. "I did not ask you to." "No," he agreed. "You had no right to come onto my land and build structures without my permission." "That's true," he said quietly, and there was no deflection in his voice, no attempt to sidestep or minimize. He simply acknowledged it and kept his gray eyes on her face. She had prepared an entire speech on the walk over. It had involved words like trespass and presumption, and the fact that she was a woman who had survived 2 years on this land entirely alone and did not need a neighbor deciding things for her. The speech dissolved somewhat in the face of his complete lack of argument. "Why?" she demanded. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing the precise words the way a man might choose which stones to cross a river on. "The deer have been coming down from the North Ridge," he said. "I watched them get into your squash twice last week. You work hard on that garden. It seemed wrong to watch them ruin it when I could do something about it." The simplicity of it landed differently than she expected. She had braced for arrogance, for some possessive justification, for the kind of words that men sometimes use that made women into projects or purposes. Instead, there was just a man who had watched deer eat her squash and decided to do something about it, and the honesty of it cracked something small and guarded inside her chest. She breathed. She looked at him for a long moment across the silence of the afternoon. "The gate hinges," she said finally. Where did you get iron hinges out here? The corner of his mouth moved barely. Traded for them in Caldwell, gave up my spare axe head. She stared at him. An axe head was not a small thing. Not in 1882 in the Oklahoma Territory, where every tool a person owned was either traded dearly or dragged hundreds of miles from somewhere that had them. That was foolish, she said. Maybe, he said. He did not look like he regretted it. She turned and walked back to her property without another word because she could not trust what words might come next, and the last thing she was willing to do was say something honest to Jeremiah Haskins on a Tuesday afternoon in September with her heart doing strange and unauthorized things inside her chest. The fence stayed. She told herself she left it standing because tearing it down would be wasteful. She knew, somewhere beneath that practical justification, that she was lying to herself. It had been a hard road to this particular plot of ground in the Cherokee Outlet, and Susanna Harper had no intention of letting it get harder. She had come from Missouri 4 years ago in 1878 with her husband Thomas Harper, who had heard about the free territory lands the way men always heard about such things, from a stranger in a saloon, with too much whiskey lending the story, a golden glow it did not quite possess in daylight. Thomas had been a man full of grand visions and genuine charm and a weakness for the next horizon, and she had loved him for his brightness even when it led them into hardship. They had built the small house together, tilled the first season's soil together, survived the brutal winter of 1879 together. Thomas Harper had died in the spring of 1880, thrown from a horse while trying to break the animal on a particularly violent morning, and that had been that. The grand vision was over, the brightness was gone, and Susanna was left with 32 acres of raw land in the Oklahoma Territory, a house that still needed a proper floor, a garden that needed constant defending, and the quiet, terrible weight of a grief she did not have the luxury to fully feel because the soil did not care about grief. Crops required planting. Animals required feeding. The land required working, and so she worked it, and she kept on working it, and 2 years passed in the grinding rhythm of survival. She was 26 years old when Thomas died. She was 28 when Jeremiah Haskins arrived on the neighboring parcel. He came in April of 1882, riding a good bay horse and leading a mule packed with tools and supplies, and Susanna had watched from her window with the careful neutrality she had developed toward all new arrivals. People came and went in the territory. Some stayed, most didn't. She had watched 3 different families attempt the parcel to the north of her property over the past 2 years, and every one of them had broken and left before autumn. The land was honest about what it demanded, and most people found the terms too steep. Jeremiah Haskins had not looked at the land the way those other families did, with that mixture of hope and terror that she had learned to recognize as the expression of people who were already calculating their retreat. He had looked at it the way you looked at something you intended to understand completely, slowly, over a long time, with no illusions and no shortcuts. He had dismounted, walked the perimeter of the parcel with his hand trailing through the tall grass, crouched down and picked up a fistful of earth and smelled it, and then he had made camp right there and started building the next morning. She had found herself watching more than she meant to over the following weeks. There was something about the way he moved through his labor that was different from the men she had observed before. He was methodical without being mechanical, efficient without being hurried. He seemed to have no wasted motion in him, and yet he was not grim about the work the way desperate men were grim. He seemed, if anything, content, as though the building of a life from the ground up in a hard country was exactly the thing he was most suited to in the world, and he knew it, and that knowledge was enough. She had not gone to introduce herself. She was not unfriendly, but she was careful, and she had long since given up the pretense that careful was the same thing as cold. He had come to her, eventually. 6 weeks after his arrival, on a morning when she was repairing a break in her water line, he had appeared at the edge of her property with a question about property boundaries, and had helped her fix the water line without making a production of it. And they had exchanged perhaps 12 words, and that had been their entire relationship for the next 2.5 months until the fence appeared. Now the fence was there, and the iron hinges had cost him an axe head, and she was standing in her kitchen staring at the boiling kettle without seeing it, and she was in considerable trouble. She went to town the following Thursday, as she did every week, for supplies and the post. The town of Rawlins Creek was not much a general store, a livery, a small doctor's office, a saloon, a church being built by hopeful hands, and a post office that shared space with the land office in a 2-room building of uncertain lumber. It was the kind of town that existed in direct proportion to the will of the people in it, and on good days that will was sufficient. She was loading flour into the back of her wagon when she heard his name. "That Haskins fellow," said Art Coleman, who ran the general store and served as the town's informal newspaper in the absence of an actual one. "Comes in twice a week, regular, quiet type, pays in coin, which puts him ahead of half my customers." "Where did he come from, does anyone know?" asked Della Morrison, who was Art's best customer and most reliable source of questions. "Kansas, I heard, before that Texas. Word is he used to run cattle down in the Panhandle, but something happened and he came north." Susanna kept her hands busy with the flour sacks and her face turned away. "Something happened, meaning what?" Della pressed. "Nobody said exactly, but a man doesn't leave a good cattle operation in Texas for raw ground in the territory unless something pushed him. That's what I figure." "He seems decent enough," Della said, with the particular intonation that meant she had opinions she was exercising restraint about. "Oh, I'm sure he is," Art said cheerfully. "It's always the decent-looking ones that have the interesting histories." Susanna drove home thinking about what interesting histories might mean and telling herself firmly that it was none of her concern. The following week, the first genuinely cold snap of autumn arrived without warning the way they always did in the territory, dropping the temperature 20 degrees overnight and sending a hard wind down from the north that rattled every window she owned. She woke before dawn to find her kitchen fire completely out and her water bucket iced over, and spent the first hour of the day fighting the stove back to life with numb fingers. When she finally got outside to check on her animals, she found that the small lean-to she used for her milk cow had partially collapsed under the weight of a dead tree branch brought down by the overnight wind. The cow was unhurt, pressed into the corner with indignant wide eyes, but the structure was useless and the temperature was still dropping. She was trying to figure out how to brace the collapsed side when she heard boots on the frozen ground and turned to find Jeremiah Haskins standing at a respectful distance with a hammer in his hand. "I saw the branch come down last night," he said. "Thought I would offer to help if you needed it." She looked at him. She looked at the collapsed lean-to. She looked back at him. "I would appreciate that," she said, and the words came out more simply than she intended, without the careful qualifications she usually wrapped her requests in. They worked together for 2 hours in the cold, Jeremiah replacing the damaged supports with lumber he went back to his own property to fetch without being asked, and Susanna holding braces and fetching tools and working, alongside him with the practical wordless efficiency of someone who was used to physical labor and did not need to perform or explain it. He did not speak much, and neither did she, and the silence between them was the working kind, not uncomfortable, not loaded, just the quiet of two people focused on a shared task. When the lean-to was repaired and the cow resettled inside it with a fresh pile of hay, they stood in the cold morning air with the breath visible between them. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. She made a decision that surprised even herself. "There's coffee on," she said, "if you want." His expression shifted, barely something warm moving through those gray eyes before he contained it. "That'd be fine," he said. "Thank you." They sat at her kitchen table with coffee cups between them, and the story that came out of him was slow and careful and clearly something he was used to keeping close to his chest. He was 33 years old. He had grown up in Arkansas, come west at 17 to work cattle, moved through Texas and Kansas over the course of 15 years doing the kind of work that built men hard and kept them moving. He had saved his money and bought a small ranch in the Panhandle 7 years ago. He stopped there. And then, she said, he turned the coffee cup in his hands. And then there was a business arrangement that went wrong, he said quietly. A man I trusted who didn't deserve it. I lost the ranch in the resulting legal business. It took me 2 years to understand that trying to fight it through the courts was only going to take what little I had left, so I stopped fighting and came here instead. The dark past in those words was careful and controlled, but she could hear what lived beneath them, the betrayal of it, the particular wound of trusting someone who used that trust as a weapon. She recognized it not from her own experience with men but from the texture of the thing, the way it changed a person's careful quality, made them deliberate about what they let close. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it without pity. "It was a hard lesson," he said. "But it taught me to read people more carefully. I'm not sure I would have wanted to remain ignorant of that." She looked at him for a moment. "Thomas, my husband, he died 2 years ago, spring of 1880. "I know," he said. "I heard in town when I arrived. I'm sorry for your loss." "He was a good man," she said. "Not practical, but good." She paused. "This place was his dream more than mine at the start, but I've made it mine since." Something in the way she said that seemed to resonate with him. He looked at her with a quiet attention that was different from how most people looked at her. Not the prying sympathy of neighbors, not the assessing look of men who saw a widow alone on good land and calculated what that might mean for them. Just attention, real attention, the kind that simply wanted to understand. "I can see that," he said. "The land shows it." She didn't know what to do with a compliment that specific and that honest, so she refilled his coffee and changed the subject to the subject of the upcoming winter and what she expected from it. And he told her what he had observed from his own preparation, and they talked about practical things for another half an hour, until the morning had advanced enough that they both had work waiting, and he stood and thanked her for the coffee and left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him walk across the cold ground back to his own place, and she held her own coffee cup and thought for a long time about nothing she could have articulated. October came in with golden light and cool nights, and the particular beauty that the Oklahoma Territory wore in autumn like a gift from a country that was hard and violent and occasionally breathtaking. Susanna harvested her garden, the garden that the deer had not touched, not once, since the fence went up, and put up preserves and dried beans, and stored squash in the cool of the root cellar Thomas had dug in better times, and she felt the solid satisfaction of a winter's food secured. She also, with some considerable internal negotiation, found reasons to be outside when Jeremiah Haskins was working within sight. She was not proud of this. But she was also not going to pretend it was not happening, because pretending things were not happening had never been a strategy she found useful or particularly dignified. She was attracted to the man. She found him interesting. She found his particular combination of quiet competence and unexpected gentleness to be deeply appealing in a way she had not expected and could not entirely manage. These were facts. She could acknowledge facts without being controlled by them. It helped or it didn't help, depending on how she looked at it, that he seemed to have his own awareness of her. She caught him looking sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. Not in a way that made her feel observed or measured, but in the way you looked at something you found yourself returning to despite yourself. They had fallen into a rhythm of small exchanges. He brought her 2 rabbits he'd snared one morning and left them on her porch without a word, as cleanly dressed as anything she'd seen. She left a jar of her tomato preserves on his porch in return. He came to help when her water line gave trouble again, which it did with maddening regularity. She took him a pan of cornbread one evening when the smell of his own cooking from across the way had suggested he had not yet learned to make it well, which he confirmed with an expression of such genuine gratitude that she laughed, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her somewhat. She had not laughed easily in 2 years. Grief did that, not permanently, she knew, but for a time it made laughter feel like a small disloyalty to the person gone, and she had carried that weight longer than she probably needed to. He heard her laugh and something happened in his face, a softening, a kind of startled pleasure, and he said, "I haven't heard you laugh before." And she said, "No, I suppose you haven't." And they looked at each other for a moment with that particular charged awareness that neither of them was ready to name. In early November, Della Morrison rode out to Susanna's place on a Wednesday afternoon with the thin excuse of returning a borrowed pan that Susanna did not remember lending, and settled herself at the kitchen table with the comfortable certainty of a woman who had something to say and intended to say it. "You and the Haskins man are getting along," Della said. "We're neighbors," Susanna said. "Neighbors," Della repeated in a tone that assigned the word a much more loaded meaning than it carried in common usage. "He asked Art Coleman about you, you know, what you were like, how long you'd been here. Art told me." Susanna turned from the stove. "He asked about me. 2 weeks ago. He was very careful about it," Art said. "Not pointed, not obvious, but definitely asking." Della smiled. "He's a careful man." "He is," Susanna agreed, and then could have bitten her tongue for the warmth that came into her voice without her permission. Della's smile widened. "He's a good-looking, careful man." "Della, I'm just observing facts, Susanna. You observe facts. You always have." "I do," Susanna said firmly. "And right now the fact is that this pan was clean when you supposedly borrowed it, and I don't believe you needed to return it today at all." Della laughed and stayed another hour and said nothing more about Jeremiah Haskins, which was its own kind of pointed restraint that Susanna found simultaneously irritating and affectionate. The conversation left something behind, though, and what it left was the knowledge that he had asked about her. That he had been careful about it. That the attention she had felt moving between them was not something she had invented out of loneliness and wishful thinking. November brought its cold in earnest, and the days shortened, and the territory turned the color of old copper in the afternoons. Susanna was returning from the creek one morning with water buckets when she found Jeremiah Haskins standing at the edge of her property looking at something on the ground, and she set the buckets down and went to see. There was a section of her fence where a post had begun to lean. The ground beneath it had gone soft with the early freeze-thaw cycles, and the post had shifted a few inches from true. She had noticed it 2 days ago and had it on her list of things to address. He had a post-hole digger with him. "I was going to fix that," she said. "No," he said. "I saw you look at it yesterday. I thought I would get to it first if you didn't mind." She minded and she didn't mind, and the tension between those two responses was something she was very tired of navigating, and it must have shown in her face because he looked at her with sudden directness and set the post-hole digger down. "I keep doing things," he said carefully. "Without asking, I'm aware of that." "You are," she said. "It's not because I think you can't manage things yourself," he said. "I know you can. I've watched you manage things for going on 7 months, and you manage them very well." "Then why?" she said. He was quiet. In the cold morning air, the breath moved between them. "Because," he said, "doing something for you feels more important than anything I do for myself, and I don't know what to do with that except act on it, and I'm sorry if it's overstepped." The honesty of that was so complete and so unguarded that she forgot everything she was going to say in response. She stood in the cold with her empty water buckets and looked at Jeremiah Haskins, who had given up an axe head for iron hinges, and built her a fence she didn't know she needed, and brought her dressed rabbits, and helped her with the lean-to, and fixed her water line, and now stood here in the November cold with a post-hole digger, because watching her fence lean incorrectly was apparently something he could not tolerate. And she understood with a sudden full-body clarity that she was in love with this man. Not beginning to be, already, the way you discovered something that had been there for a while and you simply had not named it yet. "Fix the post," she said, "and then come in for breakfast." His eyes stayed on hers for a beat longer than necessary. "Yes," he said, "he fixed the post. He came in for breakfast. He sat at her kitchen table and ate scrambled eggs and cornbread and drank coffee, while she moved around the small kitchen with the peculiar self-consciousness of someone suddenly aware of every movement they made. And they talked about the winter ahead and the state of his roof, and whether the creek would freeze solid before Christmas. And everything they said was about the practical, and nothing they were actually communicating was practical at all. When he stood to go, he paused at the door with his hat in his hands. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. She waited. "Would you allow me to come and see you on Sunday? Not to fix anything," he said, with a slight weight on the word that acknowledged every previous visit. "Just to see you." The winter light came through the kitchen window and caught the gray of his eyes and the serious, exposed quality of his expression, and Susanna Harper, who had been careful for 2 years and guarded for longer than that, said, "Yes, Jeremiah, I'd like that." The name came out differently than she had said it before, when it was a formal acknowledgement of a neighbor. It came out warm and personal and real, and she saw him register it, saw something settle in him the way a door settles when the latch finally finds the catch. "Sunday, then," he said. He put on his hat and walked out into the November cold, and she stood at the window watching him go, and felt the warmth of something she had been very afraid of allowing herself to feel. Sunday came clear and cold and bright, and Jeremiah arrived at her door at 10 in the morning with his hair combed and his good coat on, and a small bundle wrapped in brown paper that turned out to be a book, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman that he said he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita 3 months ago and had finally arrived with last week's mail. He did not present it as a gift exactly. He said, "I thought you might want to read it. You can keep it when you're done or give it back, whichever you prefer." She held the book and looked at him. "You ordered this 3 months ago," she said. "I did." 3 months ago they had barely spoken 20 words. "You thought about me 3 months ago," she said. His expression was steady and honest. "I thought about you before that," he said. She held the Whitman and something enormous moved through her chest, and she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in out of the cold." They spent the morning talking, really talking, in the way that people talk when the careful performances have become insufficient for what they actually want to say to each other. He told her about Arkansas, about his family, a mother long gone, a father who had drunk his way through the family's small store of resources, 2 brothers he had not seen in a decade and did not expect to see again. He told her about Texas in a way that was fuller than before, about the cattle work in the early years of building something, and he told her more about the man who had betrayed him, a business partner named Carver, who had forged documents and manipulated the legal record of their arrangement in ways that had taken Jeremiah's land as effectively as a gun to his back would have. "I felt like a fool," he said, "for a long time, not because I was cheated, that's his sin, not mine, but because I trusted without being careful enough." "You said the lesson taught you to read people more carefully," she said. "Do you think you read me carefully?" He looked at her across the table with those steady gray eyes. "I think you're the most clearly written person I've ever met," he said, "and I think you work very hard to make sure nobody notices that about you." The precision of it left her without words for a moment. "That is," she said carefully, "an extremely accurate observation." "You're brave and you're capable and you're lonely," he said, not with pity but with the plain factual gentleness she was coming to understand was his particular way of delivering truth. "And you've decided that the lonely is the price you pay for the safe, and I think you made that decision when you were already in pain, and I'm not sure you've revisited it." Her throat tightened. "You're very direct for a man who builds fences in secret." "I build fences in secret," he said, "because actions are easier for me than words, but I've been working up to words for a while now." She stood up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the cold November land, her land, the land she had made her own through will and grief and 2 years of refusing to leave, and she thought about what brave meant and what safe meant, and what price you were willing to pay for which. "I'm afraid," she said, to the window, to the land, to whatever part of herself was listening, "not of you specifically. of what it would mean to let someone become important to me again. "That's reasonable," he said from behind her. "I'm afraid that you'll leave. People leave." "Some do," he said. "I've left places. I've never left a person I made a promise to." She turned and looked at him. He was still sitting at her table, still turning that coffee cup in his hands, and there was no urgency in his posture, no pressure, just the patient readiness of a man who understood that the best things required time and were worth waiting for. "This is very fast," she said. "We've known each other 7 months," he said. "We've barely spoken 7 months." "I know," he said. "But I've watched you for 7 months, and watching you work this land and tend this garden and face everything that comes at you has told me things about you that most people never communicate in twice the time." She stood at her window in the November light and felt the forbidden hope of it moving through her, the terrifying, beautiful thing she had been trying to keep at a controlled distance, and she thought, "I could be careful, or I could be alive." "Come back next Sunday," she said. He did. He came back the Sunday after that as well, and the one after that. And December settled over the Oklahoma territory with its particular brand of ferocious cold and beautiful desolation, and Susanna Harper and Jeremiah Haskins fell into a courtship that was as deliberate and thorough as everything else about the man, unhurried, attentive, honest to its bones. He came on Sundays. On some weekdays when circumstances brought them together, a shared task, a problem to solve, an excuse that was usually transparent and accepted graciously by both parties, they talked for longer than the task required. She read the Whitman and they discussed it, and he confessed that he had ordered it specifically because he had heard her mention poetry once in passing at the general store 2 months before he bought it, which told her things about his attention that settled into her chest like something taking root. He was not a smooth-talking man. He did not have Thomas's easy, bright charm. He had something she had come to value more: the quality of a person who meant what they said and did not say things they did not mean, who showed up and continued to show up, who built things, actual physical things, and the less tangible kind, with patience and care, and without drama. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday in mid-December, standing on her porch after an afternoon that had stretched comfortably into evening, and it was not dramatic. It was quiet and careful and full of everything that had been building between them for months, and she leaned into it and put her hand on his chest over his heartbeat and felt it rapid and strong beneath her palm, and she understood that the steadiness on the surface cost him something too, that underneath it he was just as frightened and just as hoping as she was. Christmas came. It was the first Christmas Susanna had found genuinely warm since Thomas died. Jeremiah came for Christmas dinner, which she cooked, and he brought a small spruce tree he had cut from the ridge, which she decorated with scraps of ribbon and a few precious glass ornaments she had brought from Missouri and kept wrapped in cloth in a trunk. They sat by the stove in the evening, and she read aloud from the Whitman, and he listened with the full particular attention that was one of the things she loved most about him. And the word love was no longer frightening when she thought it in relation to him. She had not said it, neither had he, but the word was in the room with them. January brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days and dumped more snow than the territory had seen in 5 years. And on the second day, when the snow was still howling and the temperature was brutal, Jeremiah appeared at her door in snow up to his knees with his arms full of split firewood because he had looked across from his place and seen her smoke was thin and guessed correctly that her supply was running low. He stayed through the blizzard. Not in any way that would have raised improper talk. He slept by the fire wrapped in his own bedroll, and she slept in her own room, and the arrangement was practical and uncontroversially necessary given the conditions outside. But they were in the same small house for 3 days, and those 3 days were, quietly and without either of them saying so at the time, some of the best days she had known in years. They told each other things that the ordinary rhythms of their courtship had not yet reached. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her mother's kitchen garden, and how it had been the first thing she planted when she came to the territory, how it was the continuity she had chosen to carry forward into this new life. He told her about the years immediately after he lost the ranch, 2 years of working other men's cattle in Kansas, and living in bunkhouses and understanding in a way that was physically painful what it meant to have built something and then have it taken, and how he had come to a point where he had to decide whether what had been taken was going to define him forever or whether he was going to build again. "And you chose to build," she said. "I chose to build," he said. "It's all I know how to do, really." She looked at him sitting by her stove in the blue winter light of a blizzard afternoon. "That is not all you know how to do," she said quietly. "You also know how to make a person feel less alone without making them feel managed or pitied, and that is a rarer skill than building." He looked at her steadily across the space between them, and the warmth in his eyes was so direct and undefended that she felt it move through her in a wave. "Susanna," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said, simply, completely, without preamble or performance. The blizzard moved outside the walls of her small house, all that force and cold and howling necessity, and inside the room was perfectly still. "I love you," she said back, and it was the truest and most frightening thing she had said in 2 years, and his face when she said it was something she stored in a place she intended to return to for the rest of her life. The blizzard ended. January became February. February brought a particular thaw followed by another freeze, and the particular mud-season misery of the territory in late winter. And Jeremiah came every Sunday and most Thursdays, and they were, as Della Morrison declared when Susanna ran into her at the general store one afternoon, obviously and completely in love, which Susanna did not bother to deny. It was in late February that Jeremiah arrived on a Sunday morning with something different in his face, not troubled exactly, but carrying something he was working out how to put into words. She noticed it immediately, set the kettle on before she even asked, and when they were sitting with coffee she said simply, "What's on your mind?" He turned the cup in his hands. "There's something I want to build," he said. She waited. "I want to stay here," he said, "in the territory, on this land. I've been thinking about the future in a way that is specific. And I know that's a conversation that belongs to both of us and not just to me making decisions quietly, so I'm asking." "Asking what exactly?" she said. He looked at her. "I want to marry you, Susanna. I want to build a life here with you properly, with a proper future. But before I ask that in the formal way, I want you to know that there's something bigger I've been thinking about that goes along with it, and I want to know what you think." "Something bigger than marriage," she said, bemused. "Something bigger than the fence," he said, and the slight emphasis on the word made her understand that he was fully aware of the progression of things and was speaking about it deliberately. She set her coffee cup down. "Tell me." "This land," he said. "Your parcel and mine together make 62 acres. There's good creek access, good water, decent soil if it's worked right. I've been thinking about what a real operation would look like, not just subsistence, not just surviving the winters, a proper farm, some cattle, not too many, managed right, a barn large enough to be useful, the house expanded." He paused. "A real foundation, the kind of thing that lasts generations." Susanna was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about combining the land," she said. "I'm talking about combining everything," he said. "But I want you to want that. Not because I've built it without asking and presented you with a fence to react to. I want to know if that's the future you want, because if it is, we'll build it together." The difference between this and what he had done with the fence, the growth in it, the explicit honoring of her agency in the decision struck her somewhere very deep. "You learned something," she said. "I hope so," he said. She stood up and went to the window, as she sometimes did when she needed to think, and looked out at the February land, bare and brown and cold and utterly, perfectly hers. She thought about Thomas and the dream he had brought her here with, and she thought about how she had stayed and made it her own thing separate from his dream, and she thought about what it meant to choose a future rather than inherit one. "Yes," she said, "that's the future I want." He stood up. She heard his boots cross the floor, and then he was beside her at the window, standing close, and she turned to face him. "There's a thing I want to build," he said quietly. That's bigger than a fence or a barn or any structure I've ever put up." "I know," she said. "Will you marry me, Susanna?" The Oklahoma Territory was iron cold outside the window. The sky was the pale gray of late winter, and the creek was frozen along its edges, and the land was dormant and waiting, as land always was, for what spring would bring. "Yes," she said, "I will." He kissed her, and it was nothing like the first careful kiss on the porch. It was full and warm and real, and she held onto the front of his coat with both hands and felt the solid truth of him. They were married in March, in the small church that had been completed over the winter with the labor of half the people in Rawlins Creek. The ceremony was simple and attended by Della Morrison and Art Coleman and a handful of neighbors, and Reverend Cass, who was a practical God-fearing man who could see plainly that these two people intended to honor the vows they were making, pronounced them husband and wife with genuine warmth. Susanna wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself 2 winters ago, and she carried a small bunch of dried flowers from her garden, because nothing else was blooming yet, and dried flowers from her own garden seemed right. Jeremiah wore his good coat and a clean shirt and looked at her when she walked toward him with an expression of such unguarded love that Della Morrison, standing to one side, pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. They went home to her house, their house, the start of the larger thing, and the spring came. Spring came the way it always came in the Territory, explosively, after the long restraint of winter, and the work that April and May brought was enormous and joyful, and exhausting in the way that work you are building toward a future with is different from work you are simply doing to survive. They broke new ground together, doubling the kitchen garden. They laid the foundation for the barn, which was a real project, lumber hauled from Caldwell in the wagon, 3 weekends of work from 3 neighboring families who came to help and were fed enormously in return, because that was how things were done. Jeremiah expanded the house. He added a room that spring with the kind of careful, skilled work he brought to everything, building the walls square and the roof tight and the floor level. And Susanna put her hands on the new walls while they were still going up and felt the solidity of it, and understood in a bodily way what it meant to build something meant to last. The barn went up in May. It was larger than strictly necessary for their current stock, which consisted of 3 horses, 2 milk cows, a small flock of chickens, and a new pig, because they were planning forward. The future they were building had more in it than what they currently had, and the barn was built to hold that future when it arrived. Summer found them deep in the fullest life Susanna had known on this land. The garden was abundant beyond what it had ever been because Jeremiah's expansion of it had added growing space, and he had dug a better irrigation channel from the creek that made watering less of a daily struggle. He had installed better water lines with new materials he had spent months sourcing. He had built a root cellar extension, a proper smokehouse, a good-sized chicken coop with a wire enclosure that kept the foxes out. But the most important thing he built that summer was harder to point to. He had a way of being present, not in a hovering or constraining way. He was out working from before dawn most days, moving through the labor of the place with the same methodical energy he had always had. But whenever she needed him, he was there. And when she didn't need him, he gave her the space to not need him without making her feel guilty for it. He respected her opinions on every decision they made. He brought things to her as questions rather than presenting her with completed facts. He asked her what she thought and then genuinely considered what she thought, which was something she had not experienced consistently in a partnership before and which she found, consistently, deeply moving. She was happy. Not the complicated, grieving happiness of survival, but the full, wide happiness of a person whose life had become what they wanted it to be. In August, she realized she was expecting their child. She told him on a Tuesday morning, which she thought about afterward, not a special occasion, not a staged moment, just a Tuesday morning while he was at the workbench repairing a harness, and she came and stood beside him and said, "I'm going to have a baby." He went very still, the harness in his hands. Then he set the harness down very carefully and turned to look at her, and his face was doing something extraordinary. Not just joy, though that was there, clear and full, but a profound and somewhat stricken tenderness, the expression of a man for whom something has just become entirely real. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. He pulled her to him and held her against his chest with his chin on her hair, and she could feel his heart pounding, and he said nothing for a long moment, just held on. "Are you all right?" he said finally. "I'm perfectly fine," she said into his shoulder, "strong as a horse." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I know that," he said. "I know you're strong, I'm just—" He stopped. "Frightened," she said. "Grateful," he said. "Terrifyingly grateful." She understood that. She felt it too, the weight of how much there was to lose, which was always in proportion to how much there was to have. But she had made her decision about this a long time ago, in a February window with the blizzard gone outside and the world wide open. She had chosen the risk of the full life over the safety of the careful one. "We'll be fine," she said. "All of us." He held on a moment longer and then pulled back to look at her face, and whatever he saw there seemed to settle him. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then he said, "I need to finish the house room." She laughed. He was already planning the space for it, already building. The baby was born in March of 1883, 1 year to the month after their wedding. A boy. Susanna's labor was long but not dangerous, attended by the doctor who rode out from Rawlins Creek and by Della Morrison, who had appointed herself unofficial supporter and refused to leave. Jeremiah was not in the room. It was not done, in 1883 in Oklahoma, for a husband to be present at the birth, but she could hear him pacing the kitchen with a regularity that she found both endearing and slightly amusing between contractions. The doctor put the baby in her arms and said, "A fine boy, Mrs. Haskins." And she looked at this small, red-faced, furious, perfect person and felt something for which she did not immediately have words. Jeremiah came in when she had rested and the doctor had finished and Della had fussed and departed, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with the same expression he had worn when she told him. She was expecting that stricken, overflowing tenderness, and she put the baby into his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time. His hands were so careful. His whole big frame became careful around this small thing, and the baby gripped one of his fingers in a tiny fist, and Jeremiah Haskins, who was not a man given to visible displays of emotion, pressed his lips together and looked away for a moment with bright eyes. "What do we call him?" Susanna said. "I'd like to call him Thomas," Jeremiah said quietly, "without drama, if you're willing." She had not expected that. The generosity of it, the inclusion of Thomas Harper into the future of this new life, the recognition that her love for her first husband did not conflict with the life she was building now but was a part of who she was, it moved her more than she could have said. "Yes," she said, around something tight in her throat. "Thomas Jeremiah Haskins." They named him Thomas. He was a loud and vigorous infant who established immediately that he had opinions about the world and intended to communicate them regularly, and the house that had been quiet for so long filled with the complicated particular music of a new person. The years that followed were full in ways that Susanna had learned by now to hold with both hands. She had grown to understand that fullness required the willingness to feel everything, including the frightening parts, and she had made her choice about that, and she did not regret it. Jeremiah threw himself into fatherhood with the same methodical tenderness he brought to everything, adapting his rhythms around the baby's needs with a pragmatism that impressed even Della, who had been somewhat suspicious that a man so devoted to his work would struggle to make room for the domestic dimensions. He did not struggle. He simply adjusted what he was building to account for what he was building it for. Thomas grew. In 1885, their second child arrived, a girl this time, which Jeremiah received with the same enormous careful tenderness, and they named her Clara Me for no specific person, but because the name suited her immediately when they looked at her solemn wide eyes. Jeremiah Haskins was quieter than her brother and more watchful, and she grew into a child who seemed to have inherited her father's quality of attention and her mother's quality of seeing clearly. The farm grew alongside the children. By 1885, they had a small cattle herd, 12 animals, managed carefully as Jeremiah had always said, not so many as to strain the land, enough to provide a reliable secondary income when the crops had bad seasons. The kitchen garden was so productive that Susanna began selling preserves and dried goods at the Rawlins Creek Market on Saturdays, which supplemented their income meaningfully and also gave her something she had not expected to value as much as she did: the economic independence of her own contribution, her own work in its own right. Jeremiah was proud of this in a way that had nothing performative about it. He told people about her preserves and her garden with the straightforward enthusiasm of a man talking about something genuinely excellent, and she appreciated that he did not present it as adorable or secondary, but simply as a good operation that was part of what they were building together. They argued sometimes. Not often, and never viciously, but they were two strong-willed people with different methods, and occasionally different instincts about how to approach things, and the occasional direct collision of those instincts was part of their reality. What she had discovered over 3 years of marriage was that arguing with Jeremiah Haskins was fundamentally honest in a way that made it navigable. He did not attack her or belittle her or try to win through intimidation. He stated his position with that unflinching directness, and then listened, actually listened, to hers, and they worked it out between them through the sheer force of mutual respect. Once, in a particularly sharp disagreement about whether to take out a bank loan to expand the cattle herd more quickly, she said, "You're being stubborn," and he said, "You might be right about that." And the admission was so immediate that she had to work not to laugh, and the tension broke, and they found the middle ground together. He was not perfect. He had the fault that came with his strength of character, a tendency to absorb and manage his own worries privately rather than sharing them, a residual habit of self-sufficiency that sometimes looked like distance when it was actually just his way of processing before speaking. She learned to recognize it and to ask directly when she sensed the distance, and he learned that she was safe to speak to, and slowly over the years the private worry-carrying diminished, and he brought more to her in the earlier stages. She was not perfect either. She had the fault that came with her strength, a self-reliance that could tip into stubbornness, a reluctance to ask for help that was sometimes useful and sometimes simply pride dressed up as practicality. He did not make her feel bad about this. He simply, occasionally, built things before she asked for them, and they had arrived at a private joke between them about it that involved the original fence. "I'm not going to ask you to build the shelving in the kitchen," she said one evening in 1886 when they were discussing a reorganization of the pantry. "I know," he said. "I'm simply noting that there is a shelving need," she said. "Noted," he said, with the particular warm gravity that meant he was trying not to smile. "I would not want to be accused of asking." "You haven't asked." "Good," she said. The shelving appeared 3 days later, fitted precisely to the kitchen wall with the care of a man who had measured it correctly the first time. She ran her hands along it and said nothing, and went back to what she was doing, and he watched from the doorway with an expression that was half satisfaction and half the private delight of a man who had a joke with his wife that only the two of them fully understood. In the spring of 1887, something came back to threaten what they had built. A man named Earl Fenton arrived in Rawlins Creek with a claim that he had purchased land rights to 30 acres of Jeremiah's parcel, the northern section, through a legal instrument that had been filed in Kansas before Jeremiah had registered the Oklahoma Territory claim. The claim was, on its face, the kind of document that could cause serious trouble, and the implications of it made Susanna's blood go cold in a way she recognized from the stories Jeremiah had told her about Carver and the lost Texas ranch. She was the one who first identified the problem. She had gone to the land office to file a routine paperwork update on their combined properties, and the clerk, a careful young man named Patterson, had mentioned the competing claim with visible discomfort. She drove home directly and told Jeremiah that evening after the children were in bed. He listened. He went very still in the way he went still when something serious was landing, and she could see him working through it, and she watched his face for the first signs of the private withdrawal, the habit of managing crisis alone, and then she put her hand on the table between them. "We're going to deal with this together," she said. "All of it, every piece of information, every decision, together." He looked at her hand on the table and then at her face. "Yes," he said, "together." The next weeks were difficult. Earl Fenton was not Carver exactly. He was not forging documents, but he had found an old and loosely worded land purchase agreement in Kansas that could, with sufficiently hostile interpretation, be argued to predate and supersede Jeremiah's Oklahoma Territory claim. He had a lawyer in Wichita helping him argue it, and the lawyer was not without skill. Jeremiah found his own lawyer, a man named Solomon Burke in Caldwell, who came recommended by 3 separate people in Rawlins Creek and who, upon reviewing the documentation, was cautiously optimistic. "The Kansas instrument is real," Burke told them at a meeting in his office, "but it's an agreement to purchase, not a completed deed. And it names land in Sumner County, not in the territory. The geographic description is ambiguous but challengeable." "How long?" Susanna asked. 6 to 8 months, Burke said, "if we can keep it out of the federal court." 6 to 8 months of uncertainty over 30 acres of land that formed the north pasture where their cattle grazed in the summer months. It was not nothing. If they lost it, the operation shrank significantly. If they lost the legal fight the wrong way, there were implications for their broader claim. Susanna threw herself into the documentation side of it with the complete organized ferocity of a woman who had spent 4 years keeping meticulous records of everything relating to her land, because she understood that records were power. She went through every document she had, then went through everything Jeremiah had, organizing and annotating and identifying every date and registration and correspondence that supported the validity of their claim. She wrote to the General Land Office in Washington. She wrote to the Territorial Governor's office. She was relentless and methodical, and Jeremiah watched her work with an expression that was equal parts admiration and profound gratitude. "You're extraordinary," he said one evening when she looked up from the documentation spread across the kitchen table. "I'm practical," she said. "Same thing," he said. Solomon Burke, armed with Susanna's documentation, built a case that was considerably stronger than Fenton and his Wichita lawyer had anticipated. The geographic ambiguity in the Kansas instrument was demonstrated to be irreconcilable with the territorial land. Jeremiah had registered 2 different surveyors' maps, pulled by Burke from territorial records, showed conclusively that the Kansas agreement referred to a different parcel in a different county, and that its application to Oklahoma Territory land was a stretch beyond what the instrument could legally support. The resolution came in November of 1887. The Fenton claim was dismissed. They sat in Solomon Burke's office when he delivered the news, and Susanna felt the release of 8 months of tension move through her in a long, slow wave, and she reached across and took Jeremiah's hand on the lawyer's desk, and he held it tightly. "Thank you," Jeremiah said to Burke. "Thank your wife," Burke said practically. "Her documentation was the spine of this case." Walking out of the Caldwell office into the November afternoon, Jeremiah stopped on the boardwalk and turned to her and took both her hands in his. "You saved it," he said. "We saved it," she said. "You told me 7 months ago that you wanted to build something that lasted generations. I intended to hold you to that." He looked at her in the November light, this man she had chosen with both eyes open, this man who had built a fence before she asked and learned from it and grown from it, and she saw in his face everything she had staked her trust on and found entirely real. He pulled her to him and held her on the Caldwell boardwalk with the November wind coming down Main Street and people passing around them, and she put her arms around him and held back with everything she had. They went home. The children were at Della Morrison's. Della had taken them for the day without being asked, reading the situation with the accurate social intelligence that was her particular gift. And they drove home in the wagon through the November afternoon, with the sun going low and gold over the territory, and the land all around them quiet and theirs and fully, legally, permanently theirs. That evening, after they collected the children from Della and put Thomas and Clara Me to bed with the bedtime story routine that Jeremiah had developed over the years, a different tale each night from a store of stories he seemed inexhaustible in, they sat together by the stove in the kitchen and Susanna said, "I want to ask you something." "Yes," he said. "I want to expand the garden again," she said. "I've been thinking about it. There's the eastern section past the fence. With proper irrigation, I think it could double our yield. I want to add herbs for medicinal use. There's no herb supply closer than Caldwell, and I think we could supply the territory with most of what it needs from here." He listened with his full attention, the way he always listened, the way that still, after 5 years, moved her. "That's a good plan," he said. "The eastern section has good sun all day, and the herb market is underserved. I've heard Doc Reynolds in Rawlins Creek complaining about the supply 3 different times this year." "I thought you'd say that," she said. "What do you need for it?" "I need the garden extended," she said. "And I need a greenhouse structure, something small but solid to start seedlings early in spring and extend the growing season on both ends. That would let us get 2 seasons of some of the herbs." He was quiet for a moment, the planning silence she recognized. "The greenhouse is a real project," he said, "but I can do it. I want to use glass panes from Wichita. I'll write and get a price, and we'll need to work out the irrigation extension before spring." "I know," she said. "And I want to be part of building it, the greenhouse. I want to learn how you do it." He looked at her with warm attention. "I'd like that," he said. "Good," she said, "because I asked this time." He smiled then fully, the smile that she had been seeing more of over these years as the careful gravity of him relaxed into the security of what they were together, and it still did to her what it had done the first time she saw it properly. "You asked," he said. "I did," she said. "And I'm asking for something bigger than a fence, Jeremiah." "I know," he said, "and it's going to be beautiful." They built the greenhouse the following spring, Susanna and Jeremiah together, which took longer than it would have if he had built it alone, but which was, in her honest assessment, considerably better than it would have been, because her sense of the internal spatial organization was different from his, and the final arrangement of the growing tables reflected a collaboration that neither of them would have produced independently. The glass panes arrived from Wichita in April, wrapped carefully in straw and wooden crates, and when they set the last pane in place and the afternoon light came through the glass and turned the whole structure into something luminous and warm, she stood inside it and felt the exact quality of joy she had felt on her wedding day, the joy of something built properly, built for keeps. The herb enterprise she developed over the following years became, by 1890, a meaningful part of their livelihood. She supplied Doc Reynolds in Rawlins Creek, and eventually 2 additional doctors in neighboring communities with a reliable supply of medicinal herbs, chamomile, valerian, boneset, lobelia, and others that she grew from seed and harvested and dried with care. She corresponded with a pharmaceutical agent in Kansas City who expressed interest in larger quantities of several varieties, and by 1890, she had a small but real commercial operation running out of the greenhouse and drying room that Jeremiah had built to her specifications the previous fall. The fence around the original garden still stood. It was 8 years old by then, the cedar aged to gray, and it was no longer the practical primary defense it had once been because the expanded garden had its own fencing, and the deer pressure had lessened as the territory filled in with more activity. But she never took it down. It was the beginning of something, and she kept it. Thomas Haskins, at 7 years old, asked his father one afternoon in 1890 why Mama's old garden fence was there when the new fence was the one that mattered. Jeremiah crouched down to his son's level and said, "That's where everything started. That fence is the first thing I built for your mother." "Did she ask you to?" Thomas said. "No," Jeremiah said. "Then why did you?" "Because I could see what she needed before she knew I was going to offer it," Jeremiah said. "And then she taught me that it's better to build things together when you can, so I learned to ask." Thomas considered this with the solemn 7-year-old face that was so like his father's. "She asked you to build the big greenhouse," he said. "She did. And you built it together." "We did." "Is it better?" Thomas said. Jeremiah looked toward the greenhouse where Susanna was currently visible through the glass, moving among the growing tables with the purposeful ease of a woman completely at home in what she'd made. The afternoon light came through the glass and lit her in that particular warm way, the way she looked on Sunday mornings and winter evenings and every ordinary, extraordinary day. "It's the best thing I've ever been part of building," Jeremiah said. Clara Mee, who was 5, had been listening with the characteristic quiet attention that she had inherited from both parents in different ways. "Better than the fence," she said. "The fence was necessary and good," Jeremiah said. "But the greenhouse. Your mother asked for that. She told me exactly what she needed and what she wanted, and we figured out how to build it together. That makes it different." "How?" Clara Mee said. He thought about it. "The fence was me deciding what she needed," he said. "The greenhouse was her knowing what she needed and trusting me enough to ask, and me trusting her enough to listen carefully and not decide I knew better. That's how you build things with someone you love. You don't just build for them, you build with them." In 1892, Susanna discovered she was expecting again. She was 38 years old, and she told the news to Jeremiah on a Thursday morning, and he received it with the familiar expression of stricken, overwhelming tenderness. And he also said quietly, "Are you all right? This is. I know what this is," she said. "I've done it twice. You were younger." "I am not old," she said with some severity. "No," he said, "you are not." He pulled her close and held her and said into her hair, "Are you happy about it?" She considered. "Yes," she said, "I am." The baby arrived in December of 1892, a boy again, which Thomas received with the air of one who had rather expected the family to even things out but was prepared to be adaptable. They named him William Aaron, for no particular person, just a name that sounded like itself, that fit him when he arrived loud and decisive into the world. Rawlins Creek was a real town by 1892. It had a proper schoolhouse, which Susanna had been vocally in favor of establishing from the moment the discussion arose in 1888, and Thomas was enrolled the moment it opened, and Clara Mee the year after, and they were both strong students, Thomas in the mathematical direction, and Clara Mee in the literary one. Susanna taught them at home on the weekends beyond what the school covered, because she had always held that education was not a thing you outsourced entirely and then left unattended. The land was fully established. The cattle herd had grown to 22 animals, managed with the careful precision Jeremiah had always insisted on, which meant they had never overstocked the pasture, and the grass remained healthy. The crops were reliable. The herb operation was thriving. The house was a full and solid structure now, 2 stories, with a proper kitchen and a sitting room and enough bedrooms for the children each to have their own, which Thomas had declared was the finest development in the history of the family. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in March of 1893, Jeremiah and Susanna sat on the porch after the children were in bed, which was itself an achievement given that William, at 14 months old, had strong opinions about bedtime that he communicated comprehensively. The March night was cool and clear, and the stars over the Oklahoma Territory were spread so thick and bright that the sky had depth, layers of light going back to the beginning of everything. 10 years, Susanna said. 10 years, he said. I've been thinking about the fence, she said. He made a quiet sound that acknowledged the ongoing significance of the fence in their private mythology. Was so angry, she said, when I came home and found it there. I know, he said. And then I was angry that it was so well made, she said. That was the worst part. If it had been poorly done, I could have stayed angry. I'm sorry, he said, without meaning it in the least. She laughed. No, you're not. I thought about it for weeks, he said. The fence, I planned it carefully. I didn't want to startle you or presume. I convinced myself it was entirely practical about the deer. It was practical. But it wasn't only practical. What was the rest of it? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. I wanted you to know I was watching out for you, he said. Without asking for anything in return, without making it a negotiation or a statement. Just here is a thing I built because your well-being matters to me, and I'll leave it at that. It was not subtle, she said. No, he admitted. Cedar posts and iron hinges are not subtle. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they sat in the March night with the land around them, and the house behind them full of sleeping children and 10 years of building between them. I'm glad you built it, she said. Even the way you did it, even before I asked. Because if you hadn't, I might have taken much longer to understand what I was looking at when I looked at you. He put his arm around her. What were you looking at? A man who noticed what needed doing and did it, she said. Out of care, without requiring recognition. That's a rare thing, Jeremiah. I knew it was rare, and it frightened me because rare things are worth wanting, and I was afraid to want anything too much. And now, he said. She lifted her head and looked at him. This man who had been her neighbor and her courtship and her husband and her partner in the slow, enormous work of building a life. This man with the gray eyes and the steady hands and the inexhaustible willingness to build, always to build, whatever was needed and whatever was asked. Now, she said, I want everything, all of it, as much as this life holds, and I'm not afraid to say so. He kissed her there on the porch under the March stars, and she felt the warmth of it and the certainty of it and the 10 years in it, and she held on to him the way you hold on to the things you have chosen with your full self and your full courage. The farm continued. The seasons turned. The children grew in the way children grew in those years, which was quickly, and with a vitality that made the house seem to expand around them. Thomas, at 10, developed a passion for the cattle side of the operation, and could be found most afternoons after school in the pasture with his father, learning the quiet, precise language of animal husbandry that Jeremiah taught the way he taught everything, by example and patience, without shortcuts. Clara Me filled notebooks with writing and read every book that came into the house twice, and declared at 12 that she intended to be a teacher, which Susanna received with the particular warm pride of a woman who had taught herself more than the world had formally offered her. William grew into a round, laughing child who was devoted to animals and would bring home injured birds, and once a small coyote pup that he had found abandoned, which had caused a significant domestic discussion and had ultimately resulted in the coyote being rehabilitated and released at the edge of the north pasture, which had not been Susanna's preferred resolution, but which she accepted because the look on her youngest child's face when the animal ran free was something she was not willing to have not seen. In 1896, the schoolhouse burned. It was an accident, a lamp left burning, a wind through an insufficiently latched window, and the building was gone before anyone could prevent it. The loss to the community was significant. The children of Rawlins Creek had been receiving education there for 8 years. Susanna went to the town meeting called to discuss rebuilding and stood up and said, with the directness that was her particular style, "We need to rebuild, and we need to build it better than the last one, and I am willing to organize the fundraising if people are willing to contribute and willing to work." Jeremiah, beside her at the meeting, said nothing. He did not need to. The town knew who he was and what he was capable of, and when Susanna Harper Haskins said she was willing to organize something, the town had learned over 14 years that the something got organized, completely and correctly. She raised the funds. He drew up the plans and led the building, assisted by every able-bodied man in the community who could swing a hammer, working through 2 weeks of late summer days to raise a structure that was considerably sturdier than its predecessor, with a proper stone foundation and fire-safe construction, and large windows that let in the kind of light children needed for reading. The school opened in October. Susanna stood on the steps watching the children file in and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done for the community, which was different from the satisfaction of a thing done for herself or her family, but which came from the same place. The understanding that good things were built deliberately, built carefully, built with attention and care and the willingness to work. Jeremiah stood beside her. "Good school," he said. "Very good school," she agreed. "You organized it remarkably." "We built it remarkably," she said. "You drew the plans and led the labor. The money and the will came from you. Collaboration," she said. He smiled at her. "Like the greenhouse." "Like everything since the greenhouse," she said. By the turn of the century, the Haskins farm was one of the most solid operations in the county. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but the most well-built in the fullest sense of that word. The kind of place that looked like it knew what it was and had no anxieties about proving it. The barn that Jeremiah had built in 1882 was still standing and still sound. The original fence around the kitchen garden was still standing, grayed and beautiful. The greenhouse had been expanded twice and produced, annually, enough herbs to supply a network of physicians and pharmacists across 3 counties. Susanna was 46 in 1900 and felt, as she told Della Morrison during one of their continuing regular visits, as though she was finally in full possession of herself. Not youthful exactly, but vigorous and clear and deeply, capaciously content. Thomas was 17 and thinking about college, which was a conversation that required sitting down with the family budget and the family aspirations, and having the honest practical discussion that the Haskins family had always had about large decisions. It turned out to be achievable, with careful planning, and Thomas Haskins left for the Agricultural College in Stillwater in 1901, with his father's steady handshake and his mother's fierce embrace, and the solid knowledge that he was coming from somewhere real and going somewhere real, and the road between was well built. Clara Mee, at 15, was already helping with the younger children of Rawlins Creek on Saturday mornings in a tutoring arrangement that had begun informally and had grown into something the community depended on. She had her mother's organized intelligence and her father's patient attention, and there was never any real question that she would teach. William at 8 was the most fearlessly joyful person in the family, the one who laughed loudest and asked the most questions, and had already broken 2 bones through sheer, enthusiastic physical engagement with the world, neither of which had discouraged him in any apparent way. On a warm September evening in 1901, Susanna walked out to the original kitchen garden in the fading light. The garden had been replanted countless times over 23 years, different crops in different seasons, adjusted and improved and reorganized as her understanding of the soil deepened. The fence around it was 20 years old now, the cedar posts settled deep and true, the rails weathered to the particular silvery gray of old wood that had been through everything and held. She put her hand on the gate with the iron hinges that had cost Jeremiah an axe head, once upon a time, in the fall of 1882. The hinges had been maintained and would last another 20 years at least. She heard his boots on the ground behind her and did not have to turn to know it was him. She had known the sound of his step for 20 years, and it was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. He stopped beside her at the fence. "I think about that first day," she said. "When I came home and found it here. Angry," he said. "Furious," she said, and moved even then, though I would have denied that. "I know," he said. He put his hand over hers on the gate. "It was the most frightened I had been in years, driving those posts into your land without asking. I told myself it was purely practical. I think I even believed it. It was practical," she said, "and it was something else entirely." "Yes," he said. They stood at the gate of the first fence he had ever built for her, and around them the farm was settling into the evening, the cattle in the north pasture, the horses in the barn, the greenhouse lit faintly from inside where one of the oil lamps had been left burning, the house behind them with its full rooms and its 20 years of living. "Do you know what I think?" she said. "Tell me." "I think you built this fence and it was beautiful and presumptuous and exactly right," she said. "And then I asked for something bigger and we built that together. And then everything after that we built together. And that's how it was always meant to be." "You asked," he said. "That was the whole thing, you were willing to ask. You made it possible to ask," she said. "That was your part, making it safe to ask." He turned and looked at her in the September light, this woman who had been 19 different kinds of brave and resilient and clear-eyed and loving over the span of nearly 20 years, this woman who had asked him to build something bigger than a fence and had then stood beside him and built everything else together, stone by stone and season by season and year by year. "I love you," he said, simply, as he had always said it, as he would always say it. "I love you," she said back. The September evening settled over the farm. The original fence stood gray and solid. The greenhouse caught the last of the light. The house was full of the sounds of William reading aloud to himself in the way he did, and Clara me practicing something on the old piano they had acquired 3 years ago, and somewhere in the distance, Thomas was writing a letter home from his college dormitory that would arrive next Wednesday, and that Susanna would read twice and keep in the box in the dresser drawer with every other letter he had written. The life that had been built here was enormous and specific and entire. It was made of cedar posts and iron hinges and cornbread and blizzard mornings and rabbit stew and Whitman poems, and a January kiss on a porch, and a March wedding, and 3 children and 22 cattle, and a greenhouse full of herbs, and a school rebuilt from ash, and a legal fight won through the meticulous power of documentation, and 1,000 Sunday mornings, and 1,000 ordinary days that were, looked at properly, extraordinary. Jeremiah Haskins had built a fence around her garden before she asked, and she had asked him to build something bigger, and he had and they had, and it had turned out to be a life. She opened the gate on its iron hinges and walked into the old garden, and he walked in beside her, and the gate swung closed behind them with the soft particular sound of something latching, something settled, something held. The stars were coming out over the Oklahoma territory, thick and ancient and indifferent to the small, beautiful human things occurring beneath them. The land was quiet. The farm was whole. The fence held. And between Susanna Harper Haskins and Jeremiah Haskins, everything that had ever needed building had been built, and everything that needed tending was tended, and the life between them was solid and warm and entirely, permanently, joyfully theirs.